Please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before us today.
Yes, Michael Evan Mann.
Thank you. And you're appearing in your private capacity?
I am, indeed.
I now would invite you to make a short opening statement to this committee. You understand that we're looking at the issues of media diversity and the impact on a media concentration on Australia and elsewhere. And then we'll go to some questions.
Okay, thanks very much. During the tea break, I had decaffeinated tea since it is fairly late here on the East Coast of the U.S. Senators, I appreciate this opportunity to address you today. I am Michael Mann. I hold the title of Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at the Pennsylvania State University. I am a climate researcher, a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and a recipient of the Tyler Medal for Environmental Achievement. I am here today to speak to you about the destructive role that the Murdoch media have played in the public discourse over climate change here in the United States and there in Australia. I speak from personal experience. Back in 1998, I published the now iconic hockey stick curve, demonstrating the dramatic nature of human-caused planetary warming. This powerful graph constituted a threat to fossil fuel interests, and in the ensuing 2 decades, both it and I have been subject to attacks by industry-funded groups and right-wing media outlets doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry. Foremost among them have been Murdoch News Corp media outlets, such as Fox News, the New York Post, and the Wall Street Journal here in the US, the Sun and the Times in the UK, and the Australian, the Daily Telegraph, and Herald Sun in Australia. These outlets have attacked the science of climate change and the scientists themselves, yours truly included, and they've spread disinformation about climate solutions aimed at discrediting renewable energy sources such as wind and solar. I spent a sabbatical leave in Sydney last year to collaborate with Australian researchers in studying the impacts of climate change on extreme weather events in Australia. Ironically, instead of studying those impacts, I witnessed them firsthand as I document in my recent book, The New Climate War. During my time down under, I grew fond of Australia and its people, and it was heartbreaking to watch the Black Summer play out in real time. The scenes of destruction and devastation are forever singed in my memory. They were the stark reification of the model predictions I've long studied. Dangerous climate change has now arrived for Australia, whether it's the unprecedented heat, drought, and bushfires one year or the epic floods the next. This is the new reality Australia faces, and it will only get much worse if we, that is the US, Australia, and the rest of the world, fail to act boldly and immediately to reduce global carbon emissions. As horrifying as it has been to watch these climate change-wrought disasters play out in Australia, it has been equally horrifying to watch the pernicious efforts by the Murdoch media to sow disinformation about what is happening. I'm talking specifically about efforts by Murdoch-owned papers like The Australian and the Herald Sun to promote thoroughly discredited myths, blaming the record fires last year on arson or backburning or really anything other than the inconvenient true culprit that must not be named if you're the Murdoch media. The much publicized Garneau report predicted back in 2007 that climate change-fueled heat and drought would by 2020 be apparent in the form of unprecedented bushfires. We have reaped what we have sown, and the Murdoch press is substantially to blame for serving as a megaphone of climate disinformation that has provided fodder for inactivist politicians like former US President Donald Trump and the current Australian Prime Minister. The misinformation spewed by the Murdoch media during last year's bushfires was in fact so egregious that Rupert Murdoch's own son, James, publicly denounced News Corp for the disinformation it was spreading. The Murdoch media have spent decades poisoning both our political and literal atmosphere, and in so doing, they have done a grave disservice to my friends down under, the good people of Australia. Their destructive reign must come to an end. There in Australia, here in the US, and elsewhere. It is my great hope that these proceedings might constitute the beginning of that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Just checking, so you were here over the summer bushfires last year, and obviously 2019, 2020 summer.
That's right, yeah.
And I'm interested You've said that over your time as a climate scientist that you have been subjected yourself to attacks from the Murdoch press. And the interesting phrase that you've just given us before was that the Murdoch press seem intent on attacking science and the scientists themselves.
That's right.
Could you give us a little bit of an insight into what that looks like?
Yeah.
I think to help us understand just the extent, the disinformation, the undermining of science, I'd like to understand it from your perspective, from your experience, what that has looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. And former Prime Minister Turnbull actually alluded to this modus operandi, this idea of taking somebody, whether it be a politician or a scientist, and vilifying them on the pages of the Murdoch, media outlets, basically as a way of intimidating scientists, preventing us from speaking out publicly about climate change, about the impacts, about the threat that it represents. It's a form of intimidation intended to serve as notice for other scientists. If you speak out about climate change, if you publish an iconic graph, as we did, the hockey stick graph back in the late 1990s, and it leads you to speak out about the profound implications of the science when it comes to public policy, the need to do something about climate change, we're going to come after you. We're going to make an example of you for other would-be science communicators. And it's very similar to the tactic that, again, former Prime Minister Turnbull described in how they intimidate politicians in Australia. They've done the same thing with scientists for decades now.
And is this putting an alternative view on your facts that you're representing as a scientist? Is it going to your personal character? And are they attacking the science per se, or are they attacking that you even dare to speak to the science?
Yeah, it's really, it's not in good faith, right? In science, in the world of science, there is good faith, give and take. That's part of the great, what the great Carl Sagan described as the self-correcting machinery of science that keeps us moving forward towards scientific truth. If you're wrong, then your colleagues will point it out. They'll publish comments on your articles. That's the give and take that is so valuable in science when it operates in good faith. Unfortunately, those are not the rules of engagement in the world of politics and when it comes to the Murdoch media. They're not interested in having a real debate about the science because they're not going to win that debate. There's overwhelming scientific consensus, whether you talk to the Australian Academy of Science, the US National Academy of Sciences, of which I'm a member, all the major academies around the world. There is an extremely broad consensus now among the world scientists that climate change is real, it's human caused, and it represents a threat if we don't do something about it. Those are inconvenient facts, and they are the facts. And the Murdoch media has shown no interest in engaging on the facts. Look, there's a worthy debate to be had about policy. How do we deal with this threat? What sorts of mechanisms do we use to try to decarbonize our economy? What's the role of different energy sources? There is a worthy debate to be had about that stuff, but that doesn't seem to be the debate that the Murdoch press, the Murdoch media is interested in having. Instead, as you allude to, since they can't win their case on the facts, they attempt to undermine the character of the scientists. They challenge your integrity. They engage in smear campaigns, and I've been at the center of Murdoch spread smear campaigns now for literally more than 2 decades that are aimed simply at discrediting me as an individual in an effort to discredit my science and my message.
Does it shock you that here in Australia it's represented in our media as if climate science is not settled?
It is, and of course, there are some great media outlets. When I was there, I really enjoyed, my opportunity to engage with a broad array of media outlets in Australia. None of them were Murdoch media outlets, but The Guardian, as former Prime Minister Turnbull mentioned, The Guardian has really done an excellent job in its coverage of climate change, the science, the impacts, the policy dimensions of the problem. The Sydney Morning Herald. There are a lot of great media outlets. ABC has done a number of different major programs about climate science, about the bushfires and the role of climate change, over the last year. And so there are these healthy media outlets in Australia that are trying to do the job of informing the discourse. But the Australian media is so overpowered right now by the influence of Murdoch's media empire. Controls, the airwaves other than ABC News. You've got Foxtel, then you've got the Murdoch Press, Murdoch news outlets. They have a powerful megaphone in the United States in the form of Fox News and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post, but they have an even greater stranglehold here in Australia. And it is problematic because it does end up framing the science as contested when in fact the basic science is not contested. Climate change is real, it's a problem. We would not have seen the disastrous black summer of last year, the bushfires that spread out across the continent, if it were not for the aggravating impacts of climate change.
I actually asked the head of News Corp here in Australia in this committee when they appeared about the summer's bushfires and the media companies' portrayal of the reasons and the impacts of climate change. When I asked whether they had been, whether climate change was a contributor to the summer's bushfires, Michael Miller pointed me to opinion pieces that their newspaper had written, suggesting that yes, climate change, is part of it. Yet in the news articles, as you point out, arson and other backburning were cited as the cause. Is it good enough that the Murdoch Press can print a few opinion pieces about climate change and climate science and then claim that that means the rest of their reporting is fair and balanced?
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that even in those columns, Andrew Bolt's column, that he did have a column that addressed that climate change was at least a factor. It was nice to see him concede that, but then dismissed it as, and it's almost incomprehensible. And I wish I had the headline in front of me, but it was something to the effect that, but they're good for us. And this is sort of the next stage in what I call the climate wars, as the science becomes indisputable, as people can see, they can witness with their own two eyes the impacts of climate change, and it's no longer credible to deny that climate change is here and it's having a role. Instead, we see these new tactics that are still aimed at keeping us, the bottom line, addicted to fossil fuels. And whether it's because we deny that climate change is real or we buy into their framing that it's actually not bad for us and that the solution that has been proposed, renewable energy, will somehow it somehow isn't viable or is problematic. And so what we see now is the emergence of these new tactics, what I call the new climate war. Deflection, their effort, for example, to deflect attention from the need for policies like the emissions trading scheme that was implemented under the Gillard administration and then, of course, was eliminated by Tony Abbott. One of the tactics that they've been using now is to actually convince us that we don't need those policies, that the solution is individual action, and they use that to focus attention, for example, on the mayor of Sydney, her office and their travel history. Clover Moore, they went after her in an effort to somehow present her as a glutton, as somebody with a large carbon footprint. As you all know, it actually was based on doctored documents that weren't even real, that smeared her. And it was an effort to try to make it about individuals. And by the way, these people who are telling you we need climate-friendly policies, look at their own profligate behavior. They don't put their money where their mouth is. It's an effort to deflect attention away from the needed solutions, an effort to discredit key messengers in the climate space. And so these are all the tactics that they're using. Even when they concede the science, they're doing so in a way that still challenges the notion that we have a problem and that we need to decarbonize our economy.
Mm. You talked about the tactics of deflection, division, division, yeah. Kind of doomsday, coverage and politics. Could you expand on that? How, as a scientist, do you combat this suggestion that it's all something else?
Well, of course, as scientists, we like to think that facts will prevail, facts will win the day. If we just present facts in a neutral environment, policymakers will take them to heart and will enact policies that do the will of the people and the bidding of the people. Of course, that's a fantasy world that doesn't actually exist. In the real world, as we've seen in Australia, the Murdoch media empire and fossil fuel interests have a stranglehold on the media framing of the issue and on our politics, on the politics here in Australia. They almost single-handedly defeated the emissions trading scheme. They vilified Gillard, as was already alluded to earlier, using misogynistic rhetoric to try to discredit her as a person in an effort to discredit her actions, her implementation of carbon pricing. And it was amazingly successful. Within the first 12 months, global carbon emissions dropped 10% in Australia, and prices didn't go up as the critics had claimed they would. The revenue was actually returned on a progressive basis to the people. So it was working wonderfully, but then the Murdoch media came in. They first of all mischaracterized it. They wanted to insist that it was a carbon tax, because that sort of language, even though it wasn't, it was an emissions trading scheme. It wasn't actually a carbon tax, but they were very effective in framing the entire public discourse so that this was now called a tax. And their focus groups, their internal polling told them that if they could describe this as a tax, if they could characterize it as a tax that was hurting everyday people, which it wasn't, that was an effective means of making it unpopular enough that someone like Tony Abbott could come in and get rid of it, which he did less than 2 years later. And so, yes, it's frustrating as a scientist to see that facts don't necessarily win the day when you have this very concerted headwind in the form of a massive disinformation effort promoted by the world's largest and most powerful media conglomerate, News Corp, and Rupert Murdoch. In that prohibitive environment, it's very difficult for the facts to get through and for policy to be made based on objective facts rather than political spin and, again, the sort of smear campaigns that the Murdoch media has been so effective in leveraging against climate policy and turning their sights on any politicians who would dare to advance climate policy, be them Labor or Liberals alike, or Greens or anybody.
What's your experience from talking to other scientists in relation to this? Is there a fear of putting yourself forward and debating this position, this agenda, the representation by the Murdoch press, by fear of the guns being turned on them, as scientists? Is there a fear amongst scientists as to speak out on these issues?
Well, I don't know. Let's ask ourselves, why is an American climate scientist testifying here rather than an Australian climate scientist? I think any climate scientist in Australia would be scared to death to be engaged in the sort of commentary we are here tonight, because, of course, their funding, their jobs are at the mercy of this stranglehold that the Murdoch media has on the entire political environment in Australia. So I think, this alone speaks to, yields the answer to the question you're asking. Australian scientists are cowed. We just read a story just the other day that the current administration was intimidating experts who on this energy committee who had challenged the notion of a gas-led recovery that was adverse to the interests of the Morrison government, and Angus Taylor, the energy secretary, basically challenged them, threatened them, tried to force them to change the language. That's the environment that we're living in here in Australia.
What do you think the answer to this is, Mr. Mann?
Well, I mean, it is, as again, Prime Minister Turnbull alluded to, in the past there were policies. Here in the United States, we used to have what was called I'm drawing a blank on the exact terminology, but a fairness doctrine where media outlets were expected to present objective viewpoints and balanced viewpoints, and that was gotten rid of under the Reagan administration. Australia similarly has seen an erosion of policies that are aimed at creating a fair, objective, and neutral media environment. And so I think there needs, I'm not an expert on Australian policy, but I think it's pretty clear that News Corp has been allowed to run amok and has been allowed to throw their immense power and weight and wealth around in a way that has chilled not just the discourse, the public discourse on climate, but on everything that matters to Australian citizens. I think it's pretty clear that sort of media environment does not favor good public policy. It doesn't favor, it doesn't do the will of the people that the government is supposed to be representing. So, I do think that there need to be measures taken that basically do provide some common sense, reasonable constraints on truthfulness, if nothing else. There have to be sanctions for media outlets that repeatedly lie to their readers. And I call it a lie because it's willful misinformation and disinformation that has been promoted by the Murdoch media around the world, here in the United States, in Australia. Here in the United States, of course, again, as former Prime Minister Turnbull alluded to, they played an instrumental role in this insurrection, this deadly insurrection, an attempt to overthrow our democratic government. The fact that the Murdoch media played a willful role in that should chill every person to their bones. Clearly, they need to be reined in Australia, in the United States, and around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Senator Carr.
Yes, well, Professor Mann, I'm wondering if we could follow through on that. You say measures need to be taken, talk about sanctions for willful lies. I'm just wondering, how do you see that operating?
Well, again, it's above my pay grade. I'm speaking just as a citizen who is very concerned about the impacts of misinformation and disinformation, and a citizen who's aware that we used to have tougher standards that we
So,
applied.
Professor Mann, I've represented the Labor Party on science issues for the better part of a couple of decades. So this issue about a war on science is a long-standing public debate in this country, and a couple of things occur to me. What role and what responsibilities does the scientific community have for dealing with the alternative view in terms of taking a political response to what is a political campaign? And secondly, do you think in terms of the public response on the public policy issues, why is it, do you think, this country's different, say, for instance, from what's happening in Europe or even for the United States or North America and Canada?
Oh, I suppose the difference really is just a quantitative difference, that the Murdoch media does seem to have an even greater stranglehold on the media environment in Australia, based on my experiences there, based on what I've witnessed, than it has in the United States. And it does have great influence in the United States and in the UK and in other countries. But it's almost unique. Australia is almost unique in my experience in terms of the influence that the Murdoch media has over the entire public discourse of the country. And it seems to me that they do get away with violating basic codes of journalism, right? Some of the most fundamental principles when you talk to experts in the journalism field, academics who study sort of the history of journalism, will tell you that accuracy above all else and balance are essential principles in the objective media. The News Corp media shows no evidence of either of those things.
So, Professor Mann, I want to push you on this issue because it's an easy thing to say sanctions, measures should be taken. I can hear the response if that was to be the case, and the realpolitik of such a proposition would be that
it exists in some form.
Perhaps you could
for example.
That's why I'm asking you to enlarge on that, because I could hear the arguments about freedom of the press. I could hear the arguments about government censorship. I could hear the arguments coming forward about the nature of regulation. So where in the world does the sort of proposals, or can you point to examples internationally of what actions are taken in liberal democracies that would actually allow for greater diversity of ownership, control and opinion?
So the UK is, of course, one of our oldest liberal democracies, although it has a parliamentary system.
I understand their nature, but what specific measures are taken in the United Kingdom that you would draw our attention to,
so they have
to protect freedom of speech in the broader sense of that word?
So there is a press complaints commission in the UK, and if a media outlet has engaged in the promotion of untruthful claims, they can be challenged by citizens or outside organizations. You can file a claim with the Press Complaints Commission. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a lot of teeth in it. It doesn't have much power to actually enforce its findings and decisions, but it does issue sanctions against media outlets that promote falsehoods, that engage.
All right. Well, let me just deal with that. I mean, in the United Kingdom, there was a fairly widespread argument about the misuse of media against a whole range of public figures, including access to their social media data. My recollection is nothing really happened out of that. I mean, one newspaper outlet was closed down, but it was by Mr. Murdoch himself. There was no government response to what was seen to be fundamental breaches of the law. Isn't that the case?
No, you're right. I guess what I'm really saying is that there are, again, the Press Complaints Commission. These things do exist. They just don't have much enforcement authority, and that's part of the problem. So that's
so Mr.
really
Mann, this is the
the
question.
answer.
I mean,
Yeah.
my frustration, and as I say, I've dealt with the scientific community for a very long time, and it's one thing to have a discussion about how do we ensure a diversity of opinion, but it's another thing to actually ensure that it actually happens. Now, and that's where I'm sort of trying to draw your attention to. Can you tell me?
I wish I had the answers for you.
Okay.
I'm just a
so we've got an
scientist,
analysis
and a
that says,
citizen.
okay,
Yeah.
so we've got analysis that says things are crook. This inquiry has to provide advice to the Parliament of Australia on what we do about that. And if you care to, you may wish to think more about your response and make a supplementary submission if you think it's appropriate, and it's entirely a matter for you. But it strikes me that there needs to be specific measures proposed.
Yeah. So, what I wrote a commentary about sort of what I see the role of the scientist to be in our public discourse when it comes to issues of policy relevant science. In the New York Times about 6 years ago, "If you see something, say something" is the title of the op-ed.
Yep.
And in it, I express my philosophy about this, which is that as a scientist, I see my role as trying to inform the policy discourse, to try to ensure that the policy debate over issues like climate change is informed by an objective and an authoritative assessment of the science and the risks. And I leave it to the politicians to figure out how to actually implement the policies that deal with these problems. As long as it is premised on an acceptance of the facts, then the political process is supposed to do what you're describing, supposed to figure out how we can serve the will of the people. The problem here, of course, with climate change and the Murdoch media is they have worked extremely hard to actually to attack the facts and to undermine public faith in factual discourse. And that's the problem. They're not even interested in having an objective debate about policy because they're too busy trying to distort the public's understanding of the facts.
Sure.
And that's true in the United States, and it's true in Australia as well, unfortunately.
I'll come back to this point again, Mr. Mann. If you've got, I can well agree with your assessment about the nature of the political dialogue, but what I'm seeking from you is any advice on what specific measures parliaments such as this country could adopt to actually encourage and rectify a change in the actual practice.
And I guess what I'm saying is I'm leaving it to all you all. You understand Australian law and policy, and you're ideally suited to, I think, answer those questions. I can just try to inform conversation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mann.
Thank you, Professor. Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Chair, Mr. Mann. Good morning, I guess it is over there, or very late good night.
Thank you.
You've mentioned the importance of science being able to ask questions and where there's debate, have debate around the science as opposed to newspapers attacking individuals. Have I quoted you correctly there or summarised your comments?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable summary. Yeah.
Sure. Do the press have a role to support an alternate point of view when institutions such as universities don't seem to support their own academics to put forward an alternate point of view to the established science?
So, with respect to science, it isn't individual academic institutions that really litigate that. It's authoritative bodies here in the United States, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, In Australia, you have the Australian Academy of Science, the Royal Society in the UK. These bodies exist so that there is a formal way of sort of litigating our understanding of issues, of policy relevant scientific issues like climate change. And in the case of climate change, all of these authoritative bodies around the world, every scientific society in the United States, every national academy in the world that has weighed in on the science of climate change has weighed in that climate change is real. It's human caused and it already presents risks. So those are the facts, and there really isn't room for alternative facts in the sense of a body of opinion that rejects what I just said. In the same sense that, we accept that the earth is round, that gravity is real. These are accepted scientific propositions. And, I suppose that somebody could complain that they're being censored. Some scientist who insists that gravity isn't real, that the earth is flat, might indeed insist that their views are being censored. But in fact, they're only being censored in the sense that this has been litigated by the scientific community. And what they're claiming is at fundamental odds with the community, and it violates the very premise, the very notion of skepticism, right? Skepticism is a good thing in science, but the indiscriminate rejection of overwhelming evidence based on the flimsiest of arguments, it isn't skepticism, that's contrarianism or denial, and it doesn't really have a rightful place in scientific discourse.
Sure, but your argument would say that Copernicus and Galileo, to use your example of the flat earth, they won the day, particularly Galileo, because he presented facts and people weren't able to prove him wrong in these ensuing discussions. And so over time, science has now accepted that the earth is round because the facts are there. Whereas if they had shut him down without looking to actually explore the facts, then perhaps that change in scientific view wouldn't have happened. So I guess
Galileo is an interesting example because, of course, he was subject to the Roman Inquisition. In fact, the Catholic Church did attempt to, in a sense, silence him because his scientific findings conflicted with a powerful vested interest, and that vested interest was the Catholic Church. Today, the vested interest we're talking about is the fossil fuel industry and those who promote its interests, like the Murdoch media.
Sure. But you're probably aware here in Australia, we have examples of academics, well-credentialed academics who've worked in the scientific field, and I'm referring here to Professor Ridd, formerly of the James Cook University, and whether or not you agree with his position, what you've put forward, which I think all scientists would agree with, is that if somebody has a concern or a set of facts that they wish to publish that challenges the status quo, then surely the answer to that is to engage fact with fact and a balanced, open debate to prove or disprove points of view, as opposed to, in James Cook University's case, using a code of conduct to silence him. And so there's been one court case in his favour, one against him, not based on his science, but based on a code of conduct. You might be aware it's now before our High Court, so perhaps we shouldn't discuss it too much more. But
yes, no, I'm not familiar with that example. What I would say is that, again, the way science is litigated is through the peer-reviewed literature, is through assessments by authoritative bodies like the Australian Academy of Science or the National Academy of Sciences here in the United States. So that's how science is rightfully litigated. And if you have credible arguments to make, you'll be able to publish them in the peer-reviewed literature. That's the way the scientific process works. If you can publish your findings in the literature and they are not contested, then ultimately they become part of the sort of corpus of scientific understanding. And that's how science evolves and advances.
Indeed. My question, though, goes back to the media, and that we have a number of media outlets here who will almost exclusively publish the established view among many in the community around climate change. You're criticising News Corp because they support, and you contest in many cases it's unqualified or unsubstantiated fact, but they've also been very supportive of Professor Ridd, and because
Some
of their
noise I
support,
can't hear. Sorry, there was some noise.
Sure. I guess I'm coming to the fact that does the media have a view to support, or does the media have a role to support scientists who are seeking to get their facts debated as opposed to being shut down by internal processes within a university?
And I can't speak to the specific case that you're talking about with James Cook University. What I can tell you is that, what the media should report, of course, what an objective media outlet should report is the mainstream scientific understanding on climate change. If a media outlet is claiming that climate change isn't real or isn't a problem or had no role in, for example, the disastrous bushfires of the Black Summer, if a media outlet is making those claims, they are making claims that it's not just about one study or two studies. It's about the consensus of the world's scientists. It's about the consensus of authoritative scientific bodies. And so if you continue to publish articles that the Earth is flat and gravity doesn't exist, then you are doing a disservice to your readership. And I think if there is a motive in doing that, if you're doing so to advance a political agenda, then I think it is appropriate for this body to think about rules that do require objectivity, that do provide sanctions for media outlets that knowingly present false information to the public. I think that is an appropriate matter for this body to consider. I can't tell you what the form of that would be. I know I was asked that question previously. I'm just a scientist, but I do think it's important to consider the role that this body might have in that regard.
Okay, no further questions. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Fawcett. Senator Rennick, are you on the line?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I can.
Professor Senator Rennick is over the telephone, so you won't see him, but the floor is yours, Senator Rennick.
Okay, thank you. Professor Mann, my question is, you talk about a scientific consensus. So my question is, what are the facts? And I just want to refer to two energy budgets I had here in front of me. One was given to me by the CSIRO that had a downwelling radiation from greenhouse gases of 333 watts per square metre, and one from the Australian Academy of Science that had a downwelling radiation from greenhouse gases of 342 watts per square metre. So there's a difference in downwelling radiation between the two scientific institutions, or what they claim to be in their energy budgets, of 9 watts per square metre. Now, the IPCC has claimed that the increase in radiative forcing from carbon dioxide has increased by 2 watts per square metre since 1750, regardless of cause. So given that the two scientific bodies have a difference of 9 watts per square metre, that's over 400% of what the IPCC is claiming to in the increase in carbon dioxide. Why is it that we can't question facts like that?
So, what you're citing some figures. I would have to look at them and put them in context and make sure that what you're describing is correct. But it's actually irrelevant because you're talking about some large absolute numbers. What we're dealing with is the difference between these numbers, and in a very real sense, it's actually easier to measure those differences. It's why we talk about temperature changes in terms of temperature anomalies. We don't report the actual temperature of the Earth because that depends on baselines. Different elevations are going to have different temperatures. So we measure differences, and we can often measure differences very accurately. So for example, with respect to the energy budget, we can measure the heating of the oceans. That is the best integrator that there is of the imbalance between the incoming radiation and the outwelling radiation. And we actually reported on some recent findings about ocean heat content just last year. The oceans, we have measured the highest heat content ever in the global oceans 2 years consecutively. And the increase in that heat content is entirely consistent with the estimated influence of the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations from fossil fuel burning.
But wouldn't you have to accept that if we are to benchmark human performance in reducing carbon dioxide and the alleged impacts of it on heating the Earth's temperature, that we need our scientific body to be able to record the downwelling radiation from greenhouse gases consistently and accurately?
Oh, I mean, every group is that analyzes these data is doing its best job to estimate these numbers accurately and objectively. And I would have to look at the context of what you're describing. I can't accept it at face value. What I can tell you is that we have data that actually does that integration for us. The ocean heat content is the best data that we have to measure the heat imbalance in the global climate system. And those measurements tell us that, they validate the climate model simulations. They validate our basic understanding of the impact of increased greenhouse gas concentrations from fossil fuel burning. So, I don't think there are any glaring inconsistencies, but it's easy to, point to one paper or another, and without putting it in proper context, it's very difficult to discuss what that may or may not mean. What I'm telling you is that we have very reliable data that we can use to measure the heat imbalance, and it's exactly as we expect it to be.
So when you measure that data, that's in regard to radiative heat. In regards to convection, are you saying that the second law of thermodynamics doesn't apply to heat generated from carbon dioxide?
I don't know how you might have deduced that statement from what you said. What I'm saying is that you're citing numbers that I haven't been able to vet, I haven't been able to validate, I haven't been able to put them in context. So I'm not going to comment on them because I'm not convinced that they're correct or meaningful. What I can tell you is that what you're interested in is the bottom line, and that's what we care about here, the warming of the planet due to fossil fuel burning. Then I'm telling you that we have very robust data that tell us that the planet is warming up as we expect it to.
So you were saying you're not familiar with the IPCC paper AR5 that was released in 2014.
You refer to two different reports and two different estimates, and I don't know what page of what report that might be, or what the footnotes might be, or what the error bars might be. I have no context.
Sorry, Senator Rennick.
About.
Senator Rennick,
yes.
If I could, just as chair, would just bring you back to the terms of reference of this inquiry. And I think the witness has said that they would have to, the professor would have to understand what these reports are that you're referring to. I think that's a fairly reasonable request, and we're not here to argue. We're here to ask for expert opinion. So.
Okay, and I am. So I won't refer to the CSIRO report or the Australian Academy of Science report. Are you saying you're not familiar with the IPCC report that says that the amount of radiative forcing has increased by 2 watts per square metre since 1750? You're not prepared to back those numbers?
No, I didn't say, and again, I don't have the IPCC report in front of me, so I don't know exactly what number they specify, but what you described, it is consistent with our basic understanding. The increase in CO2 concentrations from fossil fuel burning thus far amounts to a forcing of a little more than 2 watts per meter squared. So that number that you cited does comport with the basic physics of the greenhouse effect. I can't tell you what the exact number is that is reported by the most recent IPCC report and what the error bars or uncertainties are without looking at that page of the report. I wish I had committed the entire several thousand pages of the IPCC reports to memory, but my memory isn't that good, and so I do actually have
Well,
to
that's
look
the
those
figure
figures
out
up.
of the report.
Okay. Senator Rennick, we'll need to leave it there. Professor Mann, I'd just like a question on notice if I could, and that would be, you've referred to the disinformation, the fake news that's promoted by the Murdoch press in relation to climate science and climate action. I'd like perhaps if you could take it on notice, the impact of how that fake news is then promoted and shared on other platforms such as Facebook. We've got Facebook coming up next. And I just wonder, I understand I've read a few articles that you've written and participated in, and one you say, it's frustrating to see scientists being blamed. We've been fighting the most well-funded PR campaign in human history. Just on reflection, perhaps being asked questions that continue to promote that disinformation, it just must be a continuation of that frustration for you.
A little bit, I would have to say, but yeah, it's as a scientist, I came into science, into the field of science, because I love solving problems. I love crunching numbers. I would have been perfectly happy to have been left alone in the laboratory doing what I love doing. But when we published the hockey stick curve, and suddenly I was attacked, but there were efforts to discredit me as a person and to vilify me, that sort of pushed me into the public sphere. It wasn't really a voluntary effort on my part. But ultimately, I have come to embrace that opportunity to inform this very important conversation. So it's not what I signed up for. It wasn't what I thought I was doing when I double majored in applied math and physics as an undergraduate. But I can think of I feel privileged to be in a position to influence this conversation and to try to make sure that it is informed by scientific facts. And yeah, I get frustrated when I find myself in a situation where falsehoods are being promoted, and sometimes for an ideological reason, to promote an ideological or political agenda. I won't lie to you, that is frustrating. But all we can do is to continue to push on and to hope that that we do arrive at a point of better faith in our public discourse, where we can honestly debate the policies, because there's an honest debate to be had about policies. But let's not debate the facts as spoken to by the world's scientists. I hope we can find a way to ensure that our political debates about climate policy are informed by objective information. And as a scientist, I continue to work hard to try to make that a reality.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, and again, knowing it's very late over there in the US. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.